So today we're going to talk about just how that happened, why it was that the time seemed to be right for people to take ideas of communism so very seriously. All right. So first a little bit about Karl Marx and who he was as a human being. As I said before, probably a lot of you have studied Marx somehow or have been exposed somewhat to Marx, but I hope to be able to maybe give you a little bit more and maybe a few more dimensions than you've already experienced. And also I want you to think of this in the context of the rest of the class as far as, how Marx and Engels compare with the rest of the thinkers that we've studied. He was born in 1818 in Trier, which is a city in what is now Germany, but at the time Germany was not a united area. And so, that's just, it's not really terribly important, but it was not a united country at this point. Both sides of Marx's family were descended from a long line of rabbis. So this was a man whose heritage, his Jewish heritage, was very important to his family. His grandparents and great-grandparents, in other words, his grandfather and great-grandfather and so forth, on both sides of his family had been rabbis, okay? They had been teachers of the Jewish religion. And so this was a heritage that was broken in Marx's lifetime for his family. His father broke with that heritage, and then the break was made easier for Marx because his father broke with the heritage. Now, there were a lot of reasons why men and women who were Jewish in Marx's times would break with their religion. Okay. One reason was because Jewish people were discriminated against in a serious way, socially, economically, and so forth. There was a lot of anti-Semitism, and not just in Germany, but in Europe generally. And there were some really quite high prices that a Jewish person would pay for remaining true to his religion. Now, Marx's father, no doubt, was fully impacted by that discrimination. Really lived it, felt it, and so forth. But there's also evidence that Marx's father had another reason for abandoning Judaism on top of the fact that it would be easier to live his life and do his work without being a Jew. And that is that Marx's father didn't seem to be a believer. That is, he didn't seem to take the religion terribly seriously. And this probably had to do with the times, too, because they're moving into the modern world, the Industrial Revolution period, and traditions were falling away generally at this time. Okay, tradition meant a lot less to a lot of people and has ever since. Okay, so that also influenced Marx's father's rejection of Judaism. He actually converted to Christianity. Now, the conversion to Christianity, we know, was not a serious conversion in the sense that suddenly he decided that Christianity was true and Judaism was false. That was a socially convenient thing that unfortunately a lot of Jewish people were sort of pushed towards in order to be accepted, okay, in order to be viable economically as well. So we'll talk more about anti-Semitism as time goes by, but this was a period of time where there were just a lot of incentives to convert, to change, okay, if you were a Jew. And in Marx's father's case, there wasn't a deep attachment to Judaism which kept him from doing that. Okay, so I hope that you get the picture there. Jews were not, for instance, able to go to many universities. They weren't able to conduct themselves in certain businesses, either by law or more typically by social exclusion. So by converting, a lot of doors would open to people like his father. So it's not surprising that Karl Marx, also rejected his Jewish heritage. He had more, I guess, principled reasons for doing so. This was not a matter of convenience for Marx, although his father's change no doubt opened his mind up to different possibilities and made him think more critically about religion and so forth. Yet really Marx had a different reason. And the reason seemed to be that he had thought it through and just considered religion generally to be wrong, first of all, to not have any factual basis, and secondly, to be a sort of stumbling block for people. As he grew up and got older, he really elaborated on this idea that religion was not only wrong in the factual sense, but also socially a problem because it kept people from otherwise improving their lives. Okay, so we'll have to talk about Marx and religion, because religion, although he didn't believe in it, religion was a very important aspect of Marx's thought. Okay, when people believe too strongly in their religion, he thought, they do not seek other solutions in this world to solve their problems. Instead, they just hold on to their faith and they accept too much of what happens. And so he actually predicted that, you know, people would have to become less religious, Jews and Christians, before they would be willing and able to make the step from capitalism to communism, because that step would take a lot of struggle and fighting and so forth that they would not be willing to do as long as they clung to their religious faith. Okay, well, what was Marx's youth like? Well, in a lot of ways, it was really kind of typical of a college student. He went off to the University of Bonn in 1835, and he studied law like his father. And so, you know, there was a sort of trajectory he was supposed to be following here that his father no doubt wanted him to be following. But he did not fulfill his end of the bargain. He didn't fulfill his obligation. He got there. He didn't particularly enjoy the classes, okay? Whether it was just law or whether it was the university generally, we don't really know. But we do know that he complained about the university, saying that it was too orthodox, too stuffy, too traditional, okay? And so he spent a lot of time drinking, partying, you know, playing around with friends and not coming to class and not particularly successful, okay? So he didn't fail, okay, but he was not doing well enough or enjoying his situation well enough to stay. And so he quit the university and returned back to Trier. During the time when he was back in his hometown, he met and engaged Jenny Westphalen in 1836. She came from a family that was probably a few notches, you would say, above his own, okay? Jewish, but also but better off, and so in a way you might say he was marrying up, okay? And there were, again, certain expectations that would come with the obligation that he incurred from engaging Jenny, okay? I'm sure that Jenny's father expected him to go back to university, and this time to learn something and to become a lawyer and make enough money to be able to take care of his wife. Well, he did go back to school, but he didn't go in the direction that his father and father-in-law to be would have expected him to go. He didn't go in the conventional direction, as you might imagine. Now, this time he went to a different university, Friedrich Wilhelm University in Berlin. And there he said that it was a freer, more creative atmosphere, more accepting of different ideas. There was more of an air of excitement because there were different schools of thought and different ideologies being debated there. Okay, so right away he felt more engaged, he felt more interested in what was going on, and he got into the debates. Okay, now that made him a better student, okay, because he was interested in what he was doing. Now, at the university, there had been a professor who had taught there for a long time by the name of George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. And maybe some of you have heard of Hegel before. Hegel is a fairly big figure in Western philosophy. At this point, his presence was still very much felt at the university because he just died in 1831. Okay? And so there were still a lot of students at the university who had either studied under Hegel or who had learned all about Hegel's thought from others. And Hegel's thought, Hegel's teaching, was a platform from which they could spring their debates. And there were Hegelian societies formed at this university, different students forming groups to study and interpret and apply Hegel's thought. Now that's really different from what most of you have experienced in a university, because when Hegel was alive, what he did basically was he went into the classroom and he taught what he thought, because he was a genuine philosopher in his own right. He was writing constantly, and so he went in and he taught his own thought, okay, his own, ideas on history. History was a major theme for him. And so that's partly why he cut such a big path at the university, because when he had been there, he had been preaching his own ideas, okay, and very strongly and very persuasively. So even after he died, the question was, do you agree or disagree with this professor? This man had a huge impact upon people. Well, Hegel was many things to many people. Hegel's thought is sort of notoriously susceptible to being interpreted in different ways. I will say that, okay, right away, because having read some of it and pondered it and taught it in graduate class, I must say there is more than one way that you can read Hegel, and both ways are pretty convincing. But one thing that we can say fairly clearly is that Hegel was a champion of German culture. Now, why is the question, okay? But we do know that he thought that German culture, or Germanic culture, okay, was the pinnacle at his point, at his lifetime, of human achievement. Okay, the pinnacle of civilization at his lifetime, according to Hegel, was right there where he lived. And by civilization, we mean its government. That was very important. Its religion, Lutheranism. Okay, its culture, the way people live, the values that they had, and so forth. Hegel saw history as a progress, okay, towards an end. And the least we could say is that Hegel thought that at his point in time, Germany was the best, was the culmination of history so far. Now, did he say that the times were like the end of history, the ultimate achievement? There's a debate about that, about whether he meant that or not. Okay, but a lot of people picked up on this aspect and translated it into German pride. Okay. The idea of German culture being the best was very attractive, as you might imagine. So there were a lot of people who picked up on that and sort of translated into a nationalism of the idea of sort of adoring German culture, German unity, and wanting to promote that in politics and so forth. Another thing that he tried to do somehow was to show that God's hand was in history, that God was moving history forward, that God was shaping events, and that, and of course, because Germany being the pinnacle of human success to that point, in his view, that was also providence, God's will, and so forth. Now, the question is, what did Hegel really mean by God? Because when you read his work, it doesn't sound like the kind of God that most of us have become acquainted with somehow through our religion. That it's a person, a being, or something like that creates things and so forth. He interchanges the word God with reason, for instance, and with, what else is another word that he uses? Logic, okay? And words like that make it sound almost like God is a sort of consciousness or a sort of pattern, a reason that within history, but not the type of personal God that many of us have become acquainted with. So it's not clear what kind of God he meant, but people who are inclined to believe in the traditional Christian God could believe it meant that God, okay? And that God was moving through history. People who didn't believe in that God could interpret it in a different way. That was the kind of thought that he had. But you can imagine that those so inclined to German pride and the desire for German unity would be inclined to see this as the, the personal God, and the personal God willing the unfolding of history in this way and so forth. It validated their opinion of the superiority of German culture. Now, the so-called right-wing Hegelians liked those ideas, okay? Because they were all for German unity, for the strength of the government, for its military might and so forth, all of which would show that German culture was superior. These ideas should ring a bell with you, because as they, unfold and as more ideas are added, we end up with National Socialism and the Nazi movement. But Hegel is not responsible for the Nazi movement, but these types of ideas didn't come out of the blue. This was the pot from which they came out. Okay. Now, there were left-wing Hegelians. Boy, you can blame Hegel for a lot if you really want to, because on the one hand, Nazism sort of has some tie to Hegel, but also communism does as well, because we'll find that Marx liked the other parts of Hegel's theory and picked up on them. And there were students at the university called the left-wing Hegelians, okay? And they picked up on Hegel's theory of history as a rational process. They didn't like the idea of a personal God of some kind molding and shaping history, so they read Hegel's thought in a different way. And they said what it is we see history as a rational process in which human struggle is unfolding into higher and higher levels of human achievement. Okay? So they liked that idea of inevitable progress, and progress through conflict, because what they saw at their time was a developing social conflict between rich and poor. Okay, and so this fit with what they saw going on and what they were concerned about. They were concerned about the oppression of the poor. They were critical of the German, governments, and they thought that, that the poor were not being accommodated, taken care of, and so forth. So isn't it interesting, and this is a lesson in interpretation as well, that one thinker who was admittedly brilliant, okay, and wrote voluminous amounts of stuff, could be so interpreted in two different directions, okay, so differently interpreted and used to back two seemingly very different ideologies, although I hope we find out that in some ways they're not really all that different, okay. This whole idea of humanity as a sort of mass progressing towards some inevitable end is what lies behind both Nazism and communism, and partly what makes both very damaging. Okay, well, let's look at Hegel's theory a little bit more. Okay. Hegel's theory is very complex, so I am distilling it down here for you. It's hard for even graduate students to deal with Hegel, okay? But we need to know something of Hegel. We need to know what Marx and Engels mainly got from Hegel, so that's what I'm going to focus on here. Hegel saw history as a sort of cyclical but progressive process, okay? And he saw history as having stages, okay? One way to think of this process is in the first line there, as a process of contradiction, struggle, and resolution. Within any given society at any time, he said, there is a contradiction within the people, okay? That's a social contradiction, all right? And then because of that contradiction or that opposition that happens in society, there is inevitably some kind of struggle. It may take a while for that struggle to occur, but at some point it's going to occur. It may be political struggle. It may be actual violent struggle. Out of that struggle eventually comes a resolution. Things change because of the struggle. But the resolution never is perfect. Okay? There's always still inequality. Okay? There's always still a social problem that has been changed and probably made somewhat better, but still there. And that starts the whole process over again. Another way that this has often been expressed is thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. This is sort of from, like speech argumentation, right? Debate. But it does kind of capture the process that he's talking about. First, the thesis, sort of a status quo of a society. But within that status quo emerges an expressed antithesis, opposition, discomfort, okay? From the opposition and the struggle that occurs because of that, you get a new synthesis, okay, in which the opposition or antithesis is somewhat addressed, okay? But then that synthesis then is the new status quo, so the process starts over again. Now, the example that Hegel starts with is the master-slave society as the thesis, okay? Hegel says that most human societies started out at this level. If you look at ancient Egypt, ancient China, India, wherever you want to look, okay, most societies of the ancient world had slavery, okay? And in a lot of them, as we learned from ancient Greece, there were many more slaves than there were free people. And even if not all were slaves, the people who weren't slaves were still treated by slaves by their government, because there was, for the most part, outside of Greece, no experience of democracy. Okay? So, for instance, in Egypt, you had the pharaoh, and you had a large body of slaves, but you also had a lot of Egyptians. They, too, were told what to do, however, okay? How to worship, what to think, and so forth. So that's the type of society that people start out with. And Hegel thought that that was pretty natural, because he said that the first struggle exists over, and most struggles in his view exist over the issue of recognition. Everybody wants to be recognized by others as valuable, as being superior, as a matter of fact. And so people will do battle over this recognition, okay? And the people who lose are those who are not willing to go all the way, who are not willing to risk their lives for their pride. Hegel says, man is the beast with red cheeks. He's the only animal who is motivated so much by pride, okay, that he can be embarrassed. An insult can make human beings fight. But there will be many who, when it comes right down to it, will not be willing to risk their lives. So the person who is willing to go all the way will win that battle and will enslave the others. Okay? That's how it gets started. The power differential. Okay? And does that mean that those who are enslaved are somehow lesser? In Hegel's view, it didn't mean that. Okay? And in fact, he said that in a lot of ways, those who are enslaved, those who are not treated as equals by those in power, are better because they are the ones who are producing everything. They are the ones who have the active knowledge to do the farming, to do the manufacturing, to run things, okay? And they know this. And he said that over time, they are going to know, they are going to be able to be conscious of the fact that it is on their backs that the society is supported. It is because of their work, their ability to solve problems and so forth, that the society is able to operate. That's the contradiction. The initial contradiction is that you've got people who are basically equals, and everybody really knows it deep down, and yet some are being treated like animals, and others are being treated as far beneath those who have the power. And this is really glaringly apparent in the royal society, such as the ancient Egyptian. Okay? There are going to be slave rebellions, and we know from ancient history that slave rebellions did occur in Egypt, in Greece, in Rome, and elsewhere. Slaves do, when they get the chance, rebel. Okay? And ancient Rome is an excellent example of the process, actually, because the slaves of ancient Rome, those people who were kept very, very low, kept resisting when they could, and eventually did earn sort of a nominal freedom, and they became the plebeians, sort of nominal citizens, okay? Still doing all the grunt work, still being far less equal, but no longer completely enslaved. That was a new synthesis. And then after that, the plebeians kept pushing and pushing and pushing for more say-so in their government, okay? Republican Rome emerged. They still didn't have that much power, but they had a little bit more, okay? And as time went by, they got more and more. So that's a fairly good example. But at any rate, the first thing that is abolished is outright slavery. When a civilization gets to the point where it's abolished outright slavery, it has moved to that next stage. Okay? In America, we moved to that next stage pretty late. We started late. We're a young country. But just in the 19th century, okay, did we move to that next stage. And you could see the process happening here in America. When slaves were freed, they were still far from being equal. They had a sort of nominal citizenship, but then they became very much second-class citizens, a lot of times not even allowed to vote. Okay? There was a brief period of time when they actually could. We actually had black people in Congress, but that quickly disappeared as the society reinforced its hold over that minority population. Okay? And then it took them a lot more effort and a lot more struggle, and culminating in the civil rights movement, in order to push them further ahead. So that's a pretty good example of how people continually, when they get the chance, will make an effort to free themselves, to make their situation better. So that's really what he's talking about. Hegel's a little hard to take when he talks about clear-cut stages, because you know that history is not like that. You know, you can't speak of ancient slavery leading to, freedom, leading to full freedom, and so forth. So when he starts to speak in these big general terms, he loses me, because I don't see history being so cut and dry. But I think that what Marx and Engels picked up on was this process, basically, and the idea that it's struggle that moves history forward, and that people will not stand for inequality. Now, for Hegel, the reason why they wouldn't stand for it is because they wanted recognition, equal recognition. And that ultimately governments that equally recognize their rights would fulfill their aspirations. So the end would be something like a liberal democratic government or a republic, okay, in which everybody was treated equally before the law. This was not Marx's vision. Marx thought the struggle was primarily economic. It was over things. It was about social class. And so you had to eradicate the economic inequality in order to truly bring about a just end. So he thought that's what it was about. So there's a difference there. Hegel, as I said, saw the underlying human cause as the desire for recognition, pride. Everybody needs respect, the esteem of others. Hegel said that we only know ourselves insofar as we are reflected in others, because we're social beings. And so when they act like we aren't their equals, when they act like we are not even human beings, this is the worst thing that can happen to a person. It's the most hurtful thing that can happen. So Hegel would have been quite all right with quite a bit of economic inequality, as long as the society treated people equally under the law, and as long as the society paid respect, as long as people paid basic respect to each other. Okay? So you can see that there is a difference here between Hegel and Marx, with Hegel saying that the human spirit is expressed in the desire for freedom, okay? And Marx saying, no, it's expressed by economic equality. Our country, America, reflects more Hegel's idea of the ideal end of history. Okay? We do have economic disparities, although not as bad as in the past. Okay? But there's rich and there's poor and there's everything in between. but at least most of the time, although not all the time, okay, the law applies equally to different classes of people. We are running into some trouble with that now, aren't we? Because the power of money and the science of law has reached such a height that it does seem sometimes like the law doesn't equally apply to everybody. Okay. That could be a real problem. But this type of government is more what Hegel would have thought of. So obviously they diverge quite a bit there. Marx took what he thought made sense to him. Okay. Marx finished his education in 1841 with a doctoral degree. And at that time, there weren't a lot of university professor jobs available, nor is it clear that he really wanted a university professor job. Most times when people get a doctoral degree, they do become some sort of professor or teacher. But Marx, by this time, was pretty energized anyway on behalf of the working class, the poor, and he wanted to do something really what he thought would be meaningful with his life. And so he got into journalism instead, and he was willing to not get paid very much at all in order to do that. Radical journalism at this time was illegal. Okay? Radical journalism meaning journalism which criticized the government and the upper classes and spoke of, you know, great social change and so forth. This was not legal. And government officials could come in and confiscate their printing presses, and did, and arrest people who wrote these things. Okay? So he was getting into something that that really was dangerous, potentially. Certainly wasn't a cushy thing that paid a lot of money. His journalism days led him even more in the direction of seeing problems as primarily economic. He was very interested in the growing labor movement. At this time, factory production was in full swing, and people were talking about unionizing and trying to organize so that they could raise their wages, but they weren't being successful because there were so many people looking for jobs. They could just be fired, and somebody else could be fired. But Marx was very interested in the labor movement and in the general, you know, workers' condition, workers' rights, and so forth. That's where he was at. Now, I just want to stop for a moment and ask, what other causes could there be for social problems? Obviously, it was clear to him, he thought, that social problems were caused by poverty. All right, that was his answer. And I picked the issue of crime just to kind of get us to think, so that we can think about this down the road, okay, again. Marx and a lot of other people have said that the main cause of crime is poverty, okay? There are other possibilities, however, okay? Can anybody think of some other reasons for crime? Think of people who aren't particularly poor. Okay? Why do people that are not particularly poor commit crimes? Greed, okay? The corporate crimes with people that are already making a lot of money, but they do illegal things to make even more money. So it's not the case that a wealthy person is incapable of committing crime, right? Okay? What about the teenager from the upper middle class that commits crime? What motivates that person? What was that? Excitement and what? Attention, right. I mean, there's a lot of different reasons, but that's got to be one of them, is sort of, you know, help, look at me, I need some help, you know? Or I want to look, you know, good in front of my peers or whatever. There's a lot of other reasons why people do things that don't conform to society's expectations, or we wouldn't now know that upper middle class people and rich people can also commit crimes, okay? So, but at their time, those examples weren't really available, okay? Although they didn't give a whole lot of thought to it either, okay? But they would have said the reason why people commit crimes, why they steal, why they break things is because they are poor, because they're dissatisfied, they're alienated, and, you know, they're lashing out, they're trying to get something, okay? At their time, that was probably a fairly good explanation. The socialist explanation for crime, though, these days is less convincing, because a lot of poor people don't commit crime, okay? And a lot of middle class and upper middle class people do commit various crimes, okay? There's no necessary correlation between your income level and your propensity to commit crime. Okay. So we've talked about Hegel's influence. There was another intellectual influence on Marx in his early development, and that is the thinker Ludwig Feuerbach. Feuerbach was a philosopher. Some call him a psychologist. Disciplines were not clearly delineated, okay? But he certainly spent a lot of time on what we would call psychology. He was a student of Hegel's, and he said many things. He wrote many things. But again, I'm going to focus in on what Marx got from this thinker, okay? This is the thinker from whom he finally got his reading, his full reading on the significance of religion. Because Feuerbach postulated that God did not create man, but rather man created God. He overturned the common notion of the deity, basically, okay, and said that from studying anthropology and ancient history, as well as more modern times, he could see that people created images of God as a sort of projection of their own best qualities, okay, and their own aspirations and their own ideals. They would create a god or gods that reflected those, okay? And why did they do this? Well, first, because human beings can comprehend infinity, they can comprehend perfection, and yet they see in the world around them that there is no real perfection, okay? Yet they can think of perfection. They have to have a place to put that perfection, since they can't live it and they don't see it in their own lives, okay? So they create a God figure to embody their own ideas of perfection. An expression of human beings' moral aspirations. No, they may not comply with moral ideals, but it is a way of regulating their morality to believe in a God that cares about morality, okay? So that is a way of enforcing humans' moral rules, okay? But probably the most important explanation for Marx was here, that man's creation of God is a product of our need to cope. Now, for Feuerbach, a lot of that coping had to do with death. Okay, how do human beings handle the issue of death? We know that we all cease to exist at a certain point, and this is a huge issue for primitive people as well as highly advanced people. How to deal with that fact, okay? And that we don't know what happens after this with certainty, okay? Feuerbach said, well, man necessarily had to create ideas of God because there was no other way for him to cope with this fear, this unknown, okay? And this is the way that we deal with it, and then we put it aside and we don't think about it as much, or we only think of it in that context, okay? Marx didn't deal with death. He wasn't as interested in that as he was dealing with the pain that he saw in people's lives and their ability to cope with that pain. One word he put for that pain was alienation. You know, when people are poor or people are being not respected by their fellow human beings, when they're being discriminated against and so forth, there's this constant pain. Physical pain, sometimes psychological pain all the time. And there has to be some way of coping with that discomfort. And when they are not able or not willing to, say, you know, lash out and just clean the clocks of the people who are doing that, then there has to be some other way for them to cope, and that's religion. That's that that idea of God. That's what Marx made of this. Okay, that's what he took from it. So it is what he called the anthropological essence of religion. The anthropological essence of religion is man's desire to cope. Okay, that's what it comes from, to cope and to deal with the problems of life. Okay. Now, Feuerbach didn't think that religion was all bad, although basically by his theory he had taken all of the truth out of it. You know, by his very theory he had stated in a way that there is no truth to it. Okay. Nevertheless, Feuerbach was talking about it being a functional thing, you know, for people to cope, a functional way of coping. Marx, on the other hand, turned that around and said it is not functional. It keeps people from fixing the problems in their lives. He had a lot more hope that the problems could be fixed, see. Now, if the problem is death, you can't fix it. Well, I'm here to tell you there's no way out, okay? But if the problem is poverty and social discrimination, those are problems that can be fixed, okay? So Marx, because he thought those were the main problems, thought that they needed fixing, that we needed to get beyond fatalism. So poverty leads to these feelings of desperation. And so Marx, through this avenue, introduced economic conditions as the main reason for the perpetuation of religion. Okay? All right, I'll just keep that up there for a second. Now, I think last time we met, I put up on the projector that the feelings of religion, Marx thought, would come to an end during capitalism. And somebody emailed me and said, didn't you mean communism? No, I meant capitalism. Okay? Because Marx and Engels thought that the conditions would become so horrendous under capitalism that people would be driven to disbelief in God. Okay? You need to remember that. They really thought the conditions in capitalism would become so bad and that social ties would be so damaged by capitalism that people would stop believing in God. Now, if that were the case, then the revolution would be easier, see, because then, in his view, they would be able to make the break with, say, moral obligations and the idea of reward in the afterlife, and just go ahead and take responsibility for their future. Okay? Now, that's a great indictment of capitalism, and I'm sure you're wondering, living in the world that you're living in now, how could capitalism be that bad? Okay? How could it be that alienating? How could it produce such feelings that people would actually be driven to despair and disbelief in God? It doesn't seem that way, you know. In our country, anyway, most people now are not that desperate, are not that, completely alienated. Well, we will be talking today still about those conditions, but the conditions at those times really different from our world today. First, a little bit more about his life. He married Jenny in 1843 and he moved to Paris. And there he met his partner for the rest of his life, Friedrich Engels, who was a German textile manufacturer. He was a son of a mogul in the textile industry. And they owned factories, for instance, in Manchester, England, and also in Germany. Okay? So they were making a lot of money off of the sweat of people whom Marx was trying to defend in his journalism. Okay? So how did these two ever get together? Well, I don't actually know how they first met, but as far as like where and so forth, but the reason why they met was because Engels, despite his family background, and despite the fact that he was continuing to make money from it, he had listened enough to socialist and communist arguments and had seen enough of conditions in factories of his time to take those arguments seriously and to want to explore more and to help out the workers' movement. So Engels was an unusual fellow. Okay? He didn't come from the poor class. In fact, neither Marx nor Engels came from the poor class. Okay? But Engels came from the upper class, from the rich, the so-called bourgeoisie. And he was directly getting money from the very type of business that was so abusive to people. Okay? And yet, he wanted to know more about the labor movement. He wanted to know more about these ideas, and he was breaking away from his own family's tradition. Okay? Now, some people find that hard to take. Why? You know, how can we take seriously Engels? How can he talk about the working class when he never directly lived that life? I can't excuse that or explain that, except for to say that despite the fact that he didn't live that life, he still seemed to have a lot of sympathy for the working class. And we can talk about, you know, the type of things that he saw in just a moment. But good for Marx and Engels, okay? His family still sent him financial support even when he turned radical and went underground and started to help Marx with the movement, with the communist movement. I mean, that was one of the main reasons why they could stay afloat at all, the Marx family, was because Engels kept funneling money to him, okay? They didn't cut him off. A lot of families would, you know, but for whatever reason, they didn't. Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about the conditions that Engels would have saw in his own textile factory. These factories were not big by today's standards at all, but they were big by the standards of those days. And this time, the time of the Industrial Revolution, a lot of things were changing fast. Machinery was changing quite rapidly. In textile factories, there were huge looms, big machines that were weaving, and human beings had to do things like bring the materials to make the threads, put them into the machine, take the thread from this machine and put it into that machine, pull a lever to make sure the machine did its operation, and so forth. Okay? These types of jobs were very labor intensive, very hard physical labor in a lot of cases. And even when they weren't hard physical labor, they were still very monotonous, doing the same thing over and over again. People felt as though they were a part of a machine. There was no thinking involved in whatever it was that they were doing. Okay? And we hear this in the literature of the time over and over again. Human beings are being made a part of a big machine. And we're not being respected as human beings anymore. We could be replaced by machines, and they often were as the machinery changed. You know, they no longer needed somebody to pull that lever or to move the bolt of cloth from here to there. Okay, and that job would be eliminated with nothing replacing it. For this type of labor, there was no minimum wage. Okay, there's no legal minimum wage. The wages were adjusted to fit the market, and at this time, there was a lot of people looking for jobs. So they paid as little as they could to keep people coming back. Okay, and if they got injured or didn't want to do it anymore, that was no big deal because there was a line of people waiting outside the door to take their place, and the job was pretty simple, so it didn't require a lot of training that they had invested in anybody. All right. So they were paid sustenance wages, as we would say, okay, just enough to keep them coming back. So it was just enough to get them some food and to pay their rent. These were people who would never own anything. They would be renting their whole lives, okay, with their apartment and barely getting by on food, okay. No maximum number of hours, okay. There were no regulations about the number of hours that people could work. And so if it was convenient, as it often was, for one person to be working from sun up to sundown, 10, 12, even more, 14 hours a day, then they could demand that they do that. And if they didn't want to lose their job, they'd have to do it. Okay? We've all heard of sweatshops in you know, Asian countries, right? and how bad people's lives are there, they're in a similar situation. Okay, they need the job, so they have to do whatever they're told to do in order to keep the job, because worse than the job is not having it. Okay, these were jobs that were often dangerous and very poor on people's health. If they would often get injured by having, you know, a machine cut off their finger or their arm and become disabled, and that was the end of them. And there's no, you know, no compensation for that. The only compensation people would get is no more job. Okay? There's no social services, and I mean all that stuff that we're so used to now. You know, there's no backup. If they couldn't afford medical care, they just didn't get it. Okay? There was female and child labor. Now, you know, female labor is no big deal, but culturally, socially at this time, women who didn't have to work would never work. Okay? And but at this time, there were a lot of openings for women in these factories for doing the lighter work, and they got paid even less. And even Marx and Engels, socialists as they were appalled by this treatment of women. And they mentioned it in their writings, that this was, you know, really egregious. And even worse than that was child labor. And there was no regulation on how old the kid had to be or how many hours they could work. Okay? So as soon as a child could do something, they went to work as well and got paid even less than women. So pretty soon you can get a picture of the whole family is working as hard as they can. Children are not going to school. Okay, they're going to work. They couldn't afford an education anyway. And everybody's working, and they have to work every day all together in order to just be able to live another day. Okay? Very, very precarious existence. If any of you have ever read Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, you have some idea of the type of life that some of these workers were living. There was a lot of disease. People died early. And in general, their lives were very, very poor. Okay. So that's what Engels saw in his own factories. Shanty towns built up around the factory, people just living to work, people being ejected whenever there was a health problem. Okay. And so I guess what happened with Engels is he began to think about these things. He was not able to see them as just, you know, workers for his family. Okay, so we have to give him some credit for at least being able to see beyond that. Engels saw Marx as the best, most promising socialist thinker of his time. So that's why he latched on to Marx and wanted to be his patron, so to speak, wanted to help him. Now, Engels was not a dull man in his own right. He was actually just as smart as Marx, I believe. And he wrote some things on his own as well. Okay? But he always gave credit to Marx. He always played second fiddle to Marx. Okay? And so Marx definitely was the leading light. And after Marx's death, Engels wrote lots of things about Marx, trying to explain his theory more. But he always gave credit to Marx. Okay? In 1844, they were kicked out of France. This happened to them several times. They were thrown right out of countries, you know. They had to flee before they were arrested. They went to Prussia, and they were kicked out of there. And while they were running around on the trying to escape the law, they were constantly coming up with their theory. They were constantly working on development of their theory, because the two of them thought that what was lacking in the socialist movement was a theory. There was the labor movement, but that was mainly born just simply out of frustration, and it accepted too much of the premises of capitalism, okay? Because all the labor movement wanted was better wages from the capitalists, or, you know, something more security from the capitalists. What was needed in their view was a comprehensive theory that was, as they put it, scientific, okay? That would convince people that their future didn't lie in cooperating with capitalists, but was in the end of capitalism, the destruction of it. Scientific, they called it, because they were going to try to show that history itself could be read, history itself could be interpreted to show that the changes were inevitable, that they weren't just a matter of choice or, exhorting people to revolt, that they were really inevitable, they were going to happen, and that it was only a matter of time. So Marx and Engels saw their role as explaining what was happening and shaping events, but not determining events. Although sometimes it's kind of hard to say that, that's what they would have, that's how they would have characterized their role. Okay. Well, when they moved to England, when they fled to England, maybe is a better word, where Engels had manufacturing factories, textile factories in Manchester, when they moved to England, they met up with leaders from the underground party, the Communist League. And the Communist League was looking for somebody who would be able to sort of put the intellectual imprimatur on what they were doing, to be able to give them a clear ideological statement of direction. Okay? They wanted Marx and Engels to develop a platform, which simply is like a manifesto, simply a party platform. Okay? That's what the manifesto means. What they wanted to do was they wanted to proclaim their existence as a party publicly. They wanted to come out from the underground. They felt like they had enough numbers, enough support, that they had a chance if they came out as a party, and a chance of getting even more people to come to their side and create a real movement. So in 1848, Marx and Engels wrote this book that you have here. It's really a pamphlet. Okay? It's not a book, it's a pamphlet. And it was meant to be read by those who were literate and clearly communicated to people who were not. Okay? So it's not a book that was at a very high level of the development of their theory. It is, however, the most influential thing they ever wrote. That's why we're reading it. Okay? They wrote a lot of stuff that was far more complex. Okay? And I'm going to be bringing some of that in. But this thing, because it is so succinct and because it is so easy to understand, okay, and to be communicated in its essentials, that's why it's had such an impact. It was picked up all over Europe, in Russia, in China, okay? Anywhere where a communist country has sprung up, this is the document that has been at the very foundation of that movement, okay? People have changed it. They've modified some of it. Mao took part of it and changed some of it to include peasants and not just factory workers, but the basic ideas. And he gave credit to Marx and Engels in the Manifesto. The first thing he read about communism was this book. So let's look at some of the basic themes. There are two classes, they say, existing in capitalist society. The workers, whom they call the proletariat, sometimes the masses, and the propertied class, the rich, who are the bourgeoisie. Bourgeoisie is an old word which comes from burgher. It means those who, out of the Middle Ages, developed their own businesses, their own property, and so forth, and were not nobles. Okay, they're where capitalism emerged from. So the bourgeoisie are those independent business owners that have enough capital to grow their business and create these factories. Okay? Now, what they clearly want to say is that in capitalism, there's really no other class. There's a vast proletariat, and it's growing bigger and bigger all the time. And there's this small group of rich people, the bourgeoisie, at the top. Mm-hmm.
Is this something that they developed just for this document, or the bourgeoisie proletariat thing, or is this something that they value, like, so I was thinking, they were because they criticized bourgeoisie, and I was wondering if that was part of the reason that they were exiled from France, because
Oh yeah,
I'm criticizing bourgeoisie, not something that
right. No, these weren't ideas that they just developed here. These were ideas that they'd been developing all along. And they didn't always state them the same way, but they were always talking about the rich and, those in government who were oppressing the poor. And that was why they were getting into trouble, because they were saying that the fault lies with them, with the people who've been in power for so long and who have not allowed for changes to take place, and we have to get rid of them, basically. We have to do something about the problem. So these were themes that they definitely were restating. Now, they did it in a really succinct way here. They didn't always use the term proletariat and bourgeoisie in other documents, but they talk about the rich and the poor, or those with capital and those who do not have property and so forth. But they're talking about the same classes. And they had developed the idea that in capitalism there is this unique situation where there's really nothing in between at all. There's nothing in between. And that there's more poor, more dispossessed people than ever before. So, and this is something that they bring out really strongly in the manifesto, okay, that it's a unique point in history. We've always had haves and have-nots, but never before in history have we had a situation where the distinction is so glaring and where there's no other possible way for people to think about the difference than money. Okay? In the Middle Ages, you had wealthy and poor, but you had this intervening variable of nobility, where people could say, well, the reason why they're wealthy and they have power is because they're nobles and because God smiles on them and so forth, and I'm common, and so, I have to accept my fate. In capitalism, they say, the illusions of superiority and inferiority fade away. And that comes out really strongly, more in this document than anything they had written before, that, in capitalism, there's no way to think of the rich as somehow better than you. They just have more money than you. And so that makes it really hard for people to take. They can't find a way in the old terms to be able to accept the difference. And we'll be looking at passages in the manifesto where they particularly deal with the uniqueness of capitalism. In a lot of ways, capitalism transformed itself out of this particular quality that they were observing. At their time, I think I can see why they characterized capitalism this way. Okay, they did not predict correctly where capitalism was headed, and we're going to talk about that quite a bit too, because it changed in ways they never thought it would be possible. But at this time, they say, and I think they're rather correct, the only relationship between human being and human being is cash. The only value that a human being has is cash, okay? And that, they say, is incredibly different from relationships of the past, and is so stark that people will reject it completely. Okay. Any other questions? That was a good question. Okay. I'm sure you'll have more as we move into this. There's always lots of questions about this. Now, they say that communists, that is, distinguished from socialists, okay? Communists, like themselves, are scientific socialism, okay? Everybody, including Marx and Engels, call themselves socialists, and we often get confused about this. Was there a difference between socialism and communism? Not until Marx and Engels made the distinction themselves, okay? Before that, the words were kind of used interchangeably. Okay, you were socialist or communist, because you had communist schemes or communist ideas. But when Marx and Engels made this statement, they said that a communist is somebody who thinks about socialism scientifically, by which we mean the study of history and the idea of inevitable change and permanent change and so forth. That's what makes them communists. They say in this document they're going to work with history, which they believe they know where it's going, that they're going to be practical, but they're not going to be so practical as to forget the principles that they believe in. They will work, for instance, with the labor people, but they're not going to buy into their agenda of just getting higher wages. But they will work with whoever they can at any time, okay? They will try to push the cause of the workers as far as they can, wherever they can, okay? But never forgetting that their ultimate goal is this overturning, this really radical overturning of the whole system. Okay. Now, let me ask you this question. If you want somebody to do something, what options do you have for getting them to do it?
Ask.
You can ask them. Okay. What if asking doesn't work?
Force.
That's the other option, isn't it? Machiavelli talked about fighting like a human and like the beast. So I guess under force you could use legal force if possible. But if that's not possible, then you're left with physical force, right? Well, they say that the distinction between them and a lot of other socialists, like Thomas More, is precisely in that utopian socialists like Thomas More and many others believe that they can just ask, that they can say, rich people, people in positions of power, don't you understand that if you keep going down this road, that people are going to, your economy is going to grind to a halt and people are going to be too poor to be able to support you? Don't you realize how illogical this is? Why don't you decide to change and you know, make some new laws and regulations and you know, create different factories that treat people more humanely and so forth? Marx and Engels pretty much chuckled at this stuff, okay? They didn't believe that asking would work in this case, because why would people who had all the power and money ever change? Well, actually, they did. Okay, in a lot of ways they did, because they began to see that they did have to keep a labor pool that was somewhat satisfied and more skilled as time went by, because labor, even in factories, became more and more skilled. You had to keep people, and it wasn't always the case that there was a huge glut of labor, so what do you do then? Okay, but it didn't seem possible to Marx and Engels that people with money would ever think anything like that or be flexible in any way. I mean, to them, looking at what they saw, they just saw greed, they saw, you know, total lack of imagination, total unwillingness to think about other people. And so they just laughed at these socialists who thought that you could work within the system. Okay. Using, say, the vote or journalistic persuasion. And after they had, you know, been thrown out of various countries and treated like criminals at the time, I'm sure you can imagine why that, you know, all that reinforced. They couldn't imagine that people would ever be more receptive to socialist arguments. Okay? But obviously, socialism has been persuasive in a lot of European countries to a greater or lesser extent without revolution. They have socialism. Okay? Even in England, there's quite a bit more socialism than there is here. Okay? And how did that happen? That happened through people voting, through sort of slow changes in government's response to people's problems and so forth. It may be good or bad. I'm sure, you know, depending on your position, you're thinking that's a bad idea. You know, why did the Europeans do this? But the fact remains, they did it without a revolution. The most socialist countries we have, okay, outside of China and a couple of other countries, are some of the countries in Europe who got there through democratic means, okay? So they were not correct that it takes a revolution necessarily to create socialism or to transform an economy. Okay? So we'll have to talk about all that too. One more thing before you go. They end this manifesto with the idea that not just in Germany, England, France, or wherever, not just in any one country, but in the whole world, workers need to unite. They need to see themselves as part of a global class. And one of the obstacles, therefore, that is keeping them from doing that is national pride. Okay? During World War I, we saw that. Okay? Mussolini was a socialist. But when it came right down to it, when his nation, you know, his national unity and pride was at stake, he became a fascist. A lot of other socialists did too. They couldn't see their way clear to not fight for their country when it came right down to it. And so this is a big obstacle to thinking, people thinking as if they're a global class. Marx and Engels thought that capitalism was going to spread around the world, and in the wake of it would come this global proletariat class.
Mussolini wasn't a Marxist socialist, was he?
He was not a Marxist, he was a socialist. He was a different kind of socialist, but he still believed in socialism in a real sense, you know, like economic equality and egalitarianism and so forth. In his youth, okay, he had accepted all that, and then as times changed, he changed. Okay? But yeah, he was a real socialist. And there are aspects of socialism in the Nazi ideology as well as the fascist ideology. The biggest one being control of the economy, that you need to control the economy, but in their case, not for the workers' benefit, but for the benefit of the state. All right, well, I'll start off with this page when we come back. I'll see you on Thursday. Maybe I better leave that up there for a second.